We good? Okay. Hello, everyone. Hi. It's nice to see you all. Thank you all for coming. My name is McAndrew. I'm from the Landworkers Alliance, a union of small farmers, peasants, and land-based workers that's based in the United Kingdom. And I'm the coordinator of the Migrant Worker Solidarity Project, which is a project which is looking into working conditions for agricultural workers in large conventional farms. Next slide, please. Essentially what this session is going to be about today is a new report that our project has produced, Debt, Migration and Exploitation. It's available at the back there for about £3 if you'd like to read it. And just to give a little background about who we are. So the Landworkers Alliance is affiliated to La Via Campesina, which is an international organization of peasant and agricultural workers unions, involving about 200 million members in 81 different countries. And for the last couple of years, we've been engaging with La Via Campesina members that represent migrant agricultural workers via the European Coordination of Via Campesina's Migrants and Rural Workers Working Group. And so through that work, we've been supporting workers taking strike action in the UK's supermarket supply chains, and we've gone on fact-finding missions to see what conditions are like in the UK supply chains in Spain and Morocco. And essentially what this report is sort of trying to replicate that work for the UK. And what we've done is investigate both conditions for workers and the structures of the new seasonal worker scheme, which is a new temporary migration scheme that governs the arrival of agricultural workers in the UK. And so this report was produced in collaboration with a number of organisations, such as the New Economics Foundation, Focus on Labour Exploitation, Sustain, and the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. And involves both sort of like economic analysis of seeing who's making money from UK agriculture at the moment. Here's a clue: it's not farmers or workers. Original worker testimonies. So we got former migrant workers who've taken part in the scheme to talk to us and write down in extended essays, what they experienced in the UK and the issues they encountered, and as well as a sort of breakdown of the sort of drivers of forced labour that are existing in this migration scheme. Next slide, please. So just to give an overview of the seasonal workers scheme. So this was introduced in 2019 with a small pilot of 2,500 workers. And the way it works is, and it's expanded very, very rapidly to cover now about the migration of about 45,000 workers each year. And so the way it works is that the government has given the contract to recruit workers from abroad to 6 recruitment agencies. The names are on the screen there: Concordia, Proforce, Fruitful Jobs, Ethereal, Ray Recruitment, and Agri-HR. And then these recruitment agencies then place workers on farms that they have contracts with. The workers who are recruited on this route may only stay in the UK for a maximum of 6 months, and then can only return again 12 months after their last arrival. In addition, the workers themselves must meet the costs of travel, they must meet the cost of rent while they're on the farm, they must meet their subsistence costs, and they must also pay quite a high visa application fee. Additionally, as well, their visa sponsorship whilst they're in the UK, so the organisation that's responsible for kind of like monitoring their migration are their scheme operators. And we'll see at the moment how these two factors of sort of like, high upfront costs and, visa sponsorship held by scheme operators contributes to an environment that facilitates the exploitation of migrant workers. Next slide, please. So yeah, just to start off by talking about the role of debt in this scheme, and this is something that became really, really apparent quite early on. So as I mentioned before, workers have to pay now £298, and this has increased by about 15% this year, to apply to the scheme, and then they must also pay for their cost of flights as well. And since the war in Ukraine, most workers on this scheme used to come from Ukraine, but now this has shifted to a kaleidoscope of different countries since the war. And so often these flight costs from countries like Indonesia, Nepal, Kazakhstan can often be over £1,000. And so this means that workers end up, when they arrive in the UK, due to the sort of like the structural requirements of the scheme, arrive with a very, very large amount of debt hanging over their heads. And this means that indebted workers cannot, if they're being mistreated by their employer, do not have the same freedom to leave as domestic workers who would not have that debt hanging over them. And they therefore have to put up with conditions, poor conditions, in order to meet these costs. And then in addition as well, as I mentioned, like there's been, after the war in Ukraine, there was a big shift from that country to lots and lots of different countries where a lot of these recruitment agencies have had no previous experience, and therefore there have been a lot of issues related to that. So I'll give the example of AG Recruitment, which was a scheme operator that lost its license in the process of this. So AG Recruitment, it's a very long-standing recruitment agency that used to source all its workers from Romania. Then after Brexit, it shifted to Ukraine. Then after the war, it had about, I think they had about 12 weeks when the war started in February to shift all of their recruitment from Ukraine to Nepal and Indonesia, countries which they had no previous business in. And in the process of doing that, they partnered with sort of manpower agencies on the ground there, which charged their workers extortionate fees in order to take part in the scheme. So, for example, in Indonesia, they partnered with a company called Alzabara, which required workers to pay, I think it was about £5,000 each to take part in the scheme. They were asked to pay for a registration fee, for information sessions, for English language classes that were not required at all. And in the process of that, often Alzabara would take into its possession the deeds to people's houses and land as collateral for the loans that they were taking out to pay these costs. And additionally as well, see this picture here. This picture is of a third-party broker who, in the process of recruitment in Nepal, took into their possession people's passports. So the way it works in Nepal is a broker would go out to a village, and then they'd approach someone, often someone that they knew, often someone via family ties. So a worker that we interviewed from Nepal, it was a cousin that approached them, saying, "Hey, I've got a connection to a recruitment agency that can get you into the UK, and you can earn lots and lots of money. However, in order for me to facilitate that, you've got to give me £2,000 and your passport." And then once they've got their possession of those documents, and once they've also got a massive amount of money from this worker, then they're in a position of power where they can say, "Actually, we need a little bit more money from you. Actually, we need a little bit more money from you." And all the time whilst this was happening, this broker was talking to the UK-based recruitment agency using a fake email address that they'd set up in the worker's name. Oopsie daisy. And this had eventually meant that the worker that we interviewed paid about £4,353 to this third party, and it was absolutely impossible for them to earn enough money whilst in the UK in order to pay off that debt, and they're still dealing with that to this day. Next slide. There is also, as I mentioned, the issue of visa sponsorship. So the way that this works is that the recruitment agency essentially holds the right for the worker whilst they're in the UK. Is responsible for deciding whether that worker gets to stay, and the relationship that they have with the Home Office. And so this often means that workers end up threatened with withdrawal of that visa sponsorship if they complain about their conditions. And this can happen at the level from individual supervisors on a farm saying, hey, if you don't work hard enough, if you keep complaining about the situation, we'll tell the recruitment agency and we'll get you deported. Or it can even happen to the level of people in the leadership of these recruitment agencies, as was the case with Justin Emery from Fruitful Jobs, who was recorded as threatening a group of workers at Haygrove Farm who had taken strike action. We'll talk a bit more about them later, saying you're here to work, not to protest, and if you don't go back to work, I'll make sure you go home. So that's the kind of like the power that's within this kind of like this visa sponsorship relationship that is built into the design of this scheme. Furthermore, scheme operators are responsible for placing workers on the farms that they work on. So so this essentially will mean that it's the scheme operator that decides where you work. And in theory, according to the rules of the scheme, if a worker says, I'm not being treated well at this farm, I don't like this farm, I'm not getting on with this, I want to move to a different one, the scheme operator should automatically approve that. But in practice, scheme operators drag their feet. They don't have, and also they only have a very limited number of farms that they have relationships with, that have contracts with, that they can send workers to. And so essentially this means that unless workers take matters into their own hands, so again, one of the, Nepalese workers that we spoke to had the experience of they were being treated really, really poorly on their farm, and so they had to take informal strike action, just refuse to work any further in order to pressure the recruitment agency to transfer them to somewhere with better conditions. Furthermore, there's also, under the rules of this scheme, scheme operators are given the responsibility for things that they do not have the capacity to do. So they're responsible for ensuring that workers are paid properly. They're responsible for ensuring their welfare is upheld. They're responsible for ensuring that they don't overstay their visas or anything like that. And it's the latter one is always what they get. That's the only reason that they ever get their visa sponsorship, that they get their contract removed. So AG recruitment that I mentioned earlier, it wasn't workers getting into debt. It wasn't workers getting abused. It was the fact that workers had left their farm and approached the Indonesian embassy to tell them about their situation. And the fact that they didn't stick to their visa requirements, that was what meant that they lost their license, not welfare issues. So responsibility for welfare, the responsibility for welfare that scheme operators have, they do not have the capacity to do this. They are recruitment agencies. So the Fruitful Jobs that I mentioned earlier, their welfare team is 2 people. And they have the responsibility for ensuring the welfare of 3,000 workers, and also as well an additional 3,000 workers if you include Agri-HR, who they have a very close relationship with and often end up doing a lot of the welfare work for as well. And then you add into the fact that there's Home Office agencies that have responsibility for welfare. There's HMRC has responsibility for minimum wage stuff. It results in, when it actually comes to a situation where workers have to say, I've got a problem, I need authorities to intervene, who's going to do something about it? It's a completely fragmented and contradictory system, and it just means that things end up falling through the cracks. And so yes, next slide, please. And all of this adds up to essentially builds a structure which leads to poor working conditions. And so I'm just going to go through a couple of the experiences that workers who've written about in this report have conveyed to us. So we have a situation where you have extreme levels of overwork, with workers working up to 14 hours a day, on one hand, so you've got extreme overwork on one hand, and then you've also got withdrawal of work as punishment. So on the farm, which the workers in the worker testimony experienced, they had a piece rate target of 20 kilos a day. Now, officially, this piece rate target was meant to be, if you pick more than this, then you get a bonus. It was meant to be an incentive, a reward. But in practice, what it meant was, if you don't reach that target, then you'll be sent back to the caravan and you won't get paid for the rest of the day. And so 20 kilos of fruit is a lot of time, and if it's a lot of fruit. And there's also the chance that if you don't reach that target consistently, then you will not be invited back for work the next day. You'll just be sort of confined to your barracks, and you won't get paid for that. And then in addition to that, you end up with endemic wage theft as well. So this is like, you're in a foreign country, we're dealing with a system that you're unfamiliar with, which is entirely controlled by the farmer. And this often meant that bits of time were not included in your pay slips. So one thing that was noted is that the time that it took to set up in the morning. So when workers on this farm woke up at 5 in the morning to get ready for work, it would take them about an hour or so to get everything set up, to get to hand out sort of carts for picking the fruit, to get registers, etc. None of that would be included in the payment. They'd only clock on after that time. And then there's also, when it comes to sort of the calculation of piece rate targets, this is done in a sort of a Byzantine, hard to understand system. And some weeks they just wouldn't include it in the pay at all. And so the worker who wrote this testimony kept a record of the hours that they worked. And they never received the full amount of pay for the hours that they worked. So as I mentioned as well, it's the scheme operators are officially tasked with monitoring conditions, and they say their narrative is everything is fine, because only 1% of workers ever complain to them. However, we've recently obtained reports of farm inspections, which are undertaken by UK visas and immigration. That's another additional thing, is that farm inspections, so inspections of working conditions, are done by immigration enforcement, not by a department that's primarily about worker welfare. And so, as well as looking into, are you being paid well? Are you being treated well? Are you following the rules? Are you working here illegally or anything like that? That's the primary important purpose of the inspections is about immigration enforcement. It's not about labor condition enforcement. But anyway, these inspections found that of a sample of 845 workers, 44% of workers interviewed raised serious welfare issues. Additionally, none of these inspections resulted in any remediation for workers. The reports so the reports of these inspections were written up months after workers were sent back to their countries. They were passed on to scheme operators for comment and redress months after anything could actually be done about this situation. So we have an labour enforcement system that is totally unresponsive to worker welfare and is primarily about the government's priority, which is immigration enforcement. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of one of these reports, and so this is an example of where so workers were, this worker was not being she was only being paid about 5 to 6 hours worth of work for 13-hour days. Often her pay was as little as £5 an hour because they wouldn't include certain things that she'd picked as being as being counted towards the piece rate. And so, as considering that this worker is someone who had come over with a lot of debt and was working to pay off that debt, this is an immense pressure to put on someone. Next slide, please. So we've had a discussion now of the conditions and the structures of the visa scheme that have sort of facilitated poor working conditions. Who's benefiting from all of this? Who's making money? And unsurprisingly, it ends up, from research that we did in partnership with the New Economics Foundation, it turns out it's the supermarkets that are making the most money out of this. So a case study farm, we looked at a case study farm that produced about 24 million punnets of strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, and apples. We were very lucky because we found a farm that listed its production statistics on its website and also had really, really complete company house statistics. So we were able to compare how much they produced versus how much they made from the sale of this fruit. And also, as well, we were able to see how many workers and how much they were paid as well. So so all of that fruit retailed for about £50.7 million. And of that £50.7 million, About 54% of that, of which about 5% is profit, went to the supermarkets. About 26% of that went to growers, and about 2% of that was profit. And of the workers, they received about 14.7% as a gross, but after the cost of flight, after the cost of subsistence, so eating and like utilities, etc., whilst in the UK, rent paid to the farmer and visa application, they got to keep just 7.6% of that. Next slide, please. So you can kind of see how this system works. So this is a cartoon that was drawn by a Mexican farm worker who was part of the coalition of Immokalee workers, who we'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. And you can see how this system works, where it's like the picker gets very little, the grower gets a little bit more, but ultimately it's the retailer. In this case, it was Taco Bell. Taco Bell was the company that they were targeting, who's making the most amount of money out of this system. Next slide, please. And so essentially what that 7.6% of value translates to for each worker is about £3,220 for a season's of work. So in this case, most workers don't stay for the full 6 months, they stay for about 4 months. And this translates to about £186 per week. And this is below UK thresholds for absolute poverty. And then that's before we add into additional issues where if workers have paid fees to a third-party broker, so for instance, the lowest fees paid by workers from Indonesia are about £1,700, they would just keep 2.9% of the value that they paid, and the reduction would go to the broker. And if they paid around £5,000, which was the case for workers from Al Zabara and the worker from Nepal that we interviewed, they lose money coming to the UK, so they get to keep just negative 4.9%. And then there's also the case of many workers, because of the problems in the recruitment system, end up being recruited quite late in the season, and so they'll arrive in late July or August, and so all of the fruit will have been picked, or it's too late for it, and they will end up having to be sent home early without much chance to earn anything, and they get to keep just 2.2%. So yes, so that's how the impacts of problems within the scheme end up resulting in sort of worse conditions worse pay for workers. Next slide, please. However, this is another key thing that we wanted to do with this work is to show that workers are not just labour inputs, because this is the other thing that, this is the way they're talked about in the press, is that there's a big labour shortage, we need more labour, never mind the people that are actually doing the work. And they're also not just passive victims who are trapped in a system with no way of standing up for themselves. In fact, they are people with their own agency and the capacity to fight back. So in the worker testimonies in this report, we reported we discussed numerous attempts of workers to take strike action to try and rectify the conditions. So on the first day of one of the workers who wrote a testimony, on the first day of their shift, there was a strike of 25 Bulgarian workers over the non-payment of piece rate bonuses. A little bit later on in the season, Indonesian workers attempted strike action over the sort of racism that they were experiencing from their supervisors. They tried to set up something, they called it a solidarity pact, where if one worker was sent back to the caravan for not reaching their piece rate targets, then they'd all go back to the caravan and refuse to work. And then there was also that example of Nepalese workers that I mentioned who refused to work until transferred to a farm with better conditions. And last year, these are stories from the 2022 season. So a story from the 2023 season was workers recruited from Chile to work on a farm owned by Haygrove Limited in Herefordshire. And so these workers experienced very, very similar treatment of being worked for 14 hours a day, one day, and then not being allowed to work the next day because they hadn't reached their piece rate targets. And in this instance, because this farm had been really struggling with recruitment, they had loaned these workers the cost of their flights to encourage them to come from Chile. And then when they came up, and then when they were on the farm, the farm said, actually, we're going to renege that deal and ask you to pay the £1,500 back now. And so all of these Chilean, well, they were workers from Chile, but they were originally from Peru and Bolivia. They all walked off and refused to work until this situation was resolved. However, this resistance at the moment has its limits, in the sense that, as I mentioned, it's a kaleidoscope of different nationalities, and often you'd have moments where one group of workers is really pissed off and really wants to do something, and they would take action on their own, but the other workers wouldn't really know what's going on. So, like in the case of those Bulgarian workers, it was like the Nepalese workers only really worked out what was happening after the strike had concluded. It just seemed like there was some kind of commotion and in a language that they didn't quite understand. So the issue of nationality means that workers are often divided, and it means their individual attempts at resistance often fail. However, what these moments of resistance show is what could happen if there was organized support for what they were doing. If the trade union movement gave support to these workers, took their cases on, and tried to provide their moments of resistance with some organizational backing, then they could take it further. So one of the workers from Haygrove is currently taking their employer to tribunal at the moment, and that's being supported by United Voices of the World, a workers' union that's very, very focused on migrant workers' rights. So we're all sort of watching very closely what will happen with this tribunal. Next slide, please. And so I also kind of wanted to show, okay, well, what alternatives are there to the situation that we have now? And also as well, what ways can worker resistance, how can worker resistance create a better situation? And a particularly good example of this is the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is based in Florida. So this is an organization of tomato pickers, primarily from Mexico and Haiti, who were experiencing extremely poor conditions, so endemic forced labor, endemic underpayment, endemic sexual violence. It was kind of known. Immokalee used to be known as ground zero for modern day slavery, and so what these workers were able to, what these workers started off doing was they started off taking strike action against their immediate farm employers, and then they came to the conclusion, well, the farm employers don't have any money either. Their prices are being driven down lower and lower and lower by the corporations. Particularly the one that came to attention was Taco Bell, who signed an agreement with all these Florida tomato pickers to, essentially say you're going to pay us an even cheaper price than what you're paying now, and then they'll pass on the costs of that cheaper price to their workers. And so what they did was they teamed up with student and faith groups, so particularly the Student Farm Worker Alliance, to try and pressure these the corporations that control the food system, so the supermarkets and fast food companies, to sign agreements with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers to pay extra for their produce, to fund wage increases, and to enforce through not sourcing from farms that didn't follow this agreement, and to enforce a whole series of measures that the workers have designed themselves to counter a lot of the similar problems that we just talked to that are affecting UK farms. And so this eventually, starting off with Taco Bell, so what the students did is they managed to push, I think, Taco Bell off about 14 US campuses. This is around 2005. And then that forced Taco Bell to say, okay, well, fine, you're affecting our business too much. We're going to sign an agreement with you. And that was kind of like the beginning of a domino effect that has now led to about 14 major buyers in the US signing agreements with the CIW, which is about 70% of the tomato market. And so what these agreements mandated is that they pay about 1 to 4 cents extra per pound of tomatoes to fund wage increases. And this has resulted in a 25 to 50% pay increase for these workers. They've also has mandated, if they do not follow this code of conduct, that these supermarkets cannot source from these farms until they rectify their situation. And so the CIW will go to farms that are not following the agreement to say, okay, well, this is what you've got to do to improve the situation. This is the changes that you've got to make. And that has resulted in the elimination of things like elimination of wage theft practices, the elimination of forced labor and sexual abuse practices, and it's transformed the situation for there. So by taking on corporate power and forcing it to deal directly with the workers, improvements were able to be won in a very, very difficult situation. Next slide, please. So yeah, that's a sneak preview of everything in this. If you want to read more and in more detail, then you can get copies of that from our store just in the back there. And if you'd like to, speak to me more or learn any more, there is my email address there. And then additionally, if you want to be connected to migrant worker organising at the sort of European level, by using that email address, you can get in contact with the ECVC Migrants and Rural Workers Group. Anyway, thank you very much. Okay, I spoke for a little bit longer than I was intending, but there we go. All right, so just going to open up the floor to questions and comments. Roz?
Yeah, amazing work, Catherine. Well done on bringing all of those different elements of the research together. Makes a really a strong case and really impressive. Oh,
goodness me. Bloody hell. Oh dear. There's another one coming.
Hello? Is that working now?
A little bit, I think.
I think that might be, yeah.
Yeah,
okay. You said you were really lucky to find the information in Companies House about the sort of profits and the production of one company. And it struck me that it was it must have been really hard to find that information, and how much transparency of that kind of information is an issue in showing up all of these injustices and problems in the system, and whether there's ways that we can sort of build more transparent processes or processes for scrutiny on the profits of companies and how that relates to worker rights.
Sure. So actually, Companies House tends to be really good on this. But the thing that we were really so often what farms will have in their accounts in Companies House is that they'll have how much money they're earning specifically from fruit sales, how much money they're paying in wages, how many workers are specifically employed in each role, etc. So actually, Companies House is an invaluable resource, not just for the agricultural sector, but in all sorts of investigations when it comes to understanding what companies are doing. The thing that we were lucky about was being able to pair that with production statistics and being able to say, okay, well, this is how much fruit that this company is actually producing, because that isn't, how many punnets of fruit and how many punnets of each kind of fruit usually isn't listed in these statistics, but it was on the website of this company. And that was what really allowed us to see actually, okay, how do we compare the total value of the produce of this farm versus the amount of money that the farm is receiving and versus the amount of money that the workers are receiving. The other thing that is an issue, though, is being able to connect farms to the supermarkets that they actually sell to. And that is something that we're actually currently working with Ethical Consumer magazine at the moment on a campaign that's looking at trying to get supermarkets to list their sort of second-tier suppliers. So these are actually the actually list which farms. We're looking at Spain in particular at the moment, but we'd also like to branch this open to the UK to see actually which farms are actually directly supplying them. And that would then allow workers and organisations that want to support them to say, okay, well, we know abuses are happening in this company, in this farm, etc., and we know that these products are then being sold on your shelves. And there was a campaign by Transform Trade a few years ago that was focused on tea production, which was really, really successful in this and managed to get pressure all 6 major tea brands in the UK to completely list, okay, these are the farms and plantations that we source tea from. And then it meant that workers in India were able to say, well, we're being treated completely against all of the standards that you've supposedly signed up to, because this is the other thing with these supermarkets. They've all signed up to something called the Ethical Trading Initiative, where they're meant to say, you know, workers have the right to join a union, workers are meant to, you know, no forced labour, they're meant to be paid properly, their contracts are meant to be clear. And these are often things that are just never followed in their supply chains. But it's always such a challenge to sort of say to a supermarket, yes, here's a case that you have to deal with because we can directly link it to you. So it's that lack of transparency in the supply chain that really, really needs to be changed, that supermarkets have the information in order to change. And you know, that's kind of like the next target in a sense. Okay, next question. Oh goodness. Oh, there's a lot. Sure.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. That was amazing. I was just wondering what the Landworkers Alliance, as I understand it, is more kind of it's not really an employees union in a typical way, and this is, you've managed to get a lot of information on this, but is there a capacity to actually organise, or would there be a kind of an option of working with a union that was, you know, like Unite or something that's part of the Trade Union Congress that could organise and actually ballot strike action and stuff like that, because we can't depend on these kind of spontaneous examples, especially with the language barriers and everything else. So what's the organisational options for fighting going forward?
Yeah, it's kind of, I completely agree. It's kind of like, in terms of like our capacity as an organisation, as you say, we're not a farm worker union that has large memberships in conventional agriculture. We're a union that's, you know, of very small farmers, very independent growers, which is it's a very different sector. And it's in terms of like, you know, in terms of like what kind of capacities do and how do we build those kind of capacities. An organisation that I'm really, really inspired by is the Worker Support Centre, which is based in Scotland and is made up of former farm workers who essentially offer, like, you know, advice and case study, like casework support to workers in Scotland that are experiencing abuses. And so that's the kind of, in terms of like, as a kind of an approach, an initial approach, I think would be, you know, seeing the proliferation of these worker support centres and sort of giving, like, you know, workers who've had that experience the employment in order to do that. I mean, one thing that really struck me is something that one of the workers that was interviewed here is, you know, I remember him telling me once that, he was really angry about what had happened to him, and the situation that had happened with him. And it's saying, like, you know, I really, really want to be able to go around to all of these farms and say, see what is wrong and try and help people and all that kind of stuff. But because of the immigration system, and because of the kind of, like, you know, the fact that, you know, they weren't able to stay in the UK and all that kind of stuff, under this scheme, they didn't have the agency or ability to do that. And it's always struck me as kind of like, in order to build the capacities of that, you know, kind of campaigning against the really, really restrictive nature of this visa scheme, I think is essential. In terms of like partnerships with Unite, I also think that's like, because Unite is the official agricultural workers union in the UK. That it's kind of where we used to have, like, you know, about 40 years ago, there was the National Union of Agricultural Workers, which then eventually folded into Unite. And Unite still undertakes sort of responsibilities via, like, you know, negotiations with agricultural wages boards, which still exist in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. But in terms of, like, actually sort of like getting into those sort of like roots, that's work that needs to be done. And kind of what we wanted to do with this report is show workers do have the capacity to resist. They do have the desire to resist, and what unions need to do is start giving support to that. And again, there's also the UVW as well, which is really starting to do some work on this. And so, we're just having fingers crossed for the Employment Tribunal. That's kind of ongoing at the moment. United Voices of the World. So it's a union that's mostly made up of Latin American workers, and is mostly been known for undertaking work in sort of supporting workers in care and cleaning. And so, but I think what was really a key for this in this dispute is because Again, it's made up of many Latin American workers, and it was Latin American workers that were being affected by this. They're able to use those networks to connect them directly with the union. And so in terms of its, it's a very, very inspiring organisation, and if it's able to make a breakthrough into supporting workers in agriculture, that would be a really, really amazing development, really. I was wondering, could we have a question from the online? Are there not any? Oh, that's great. Okay. Well, it's not, but you know what I mean.
Question about the national. Sorry, just a question about the national living wage. I mean, the amounts that you're quoting people getting paid is about half the national living wage. Does it not apply here? And if it doesn't, is that a point of leverage in any way that one could look to make it apply?
So what the issue is so actually all agricultural workers now have to be paid about £10.48 an hour, which is the national living wage. Previously, in previous years, so our data there comes from, because again, this is the thing, another kind of thing, come back to the company's house issue, is that you're always operating about 2 years behind what's actually going on, because the accounts for 2021 are released at the end of 2022, and then we've only just got released now. The accounts for 2022 released in 2023, and so in that year the wage was a little bit lower. I think it was £8.91 or something like that. So
it's still not getting there.
Yeah, it's still not getting that. No, because the issue as well is that the workers are up front they're paid £8.91 or £10.10, or as it was in 2022, or £10.48 now. But in actuality, because they've got to pay for flights, because they've got to pay for the visa application fee, because they've got to pay for subsistence, rent, utilities, all the rest of it, it means they don't get to keep the full amount that they get paid. So it ends up that the amount of money that they're actually able to take home is a lot less than what they actually get paid.
But the amounts you put up seem to be before those deductions. They were getting like £3 grand for working in a summer or something. That's before those deductions even, I thought. So it felt like they weren't even getting the...
That's after those deductions.
Oh, it's after, is
That's
it?
after those deductions.
Okay, I see, okay.
Yeah, I should have been a bit more clearer there. No, I think gross it comes to about £5,000, which is more in line with... and again, it gives the full figures in there. We've got an appendix where we go through all of this in the report. But after those deductions, it comes to about £3,000.
So maybe with piece rate pay, they can sort of cook rather than our rate pay, they can sort of fiddle the rates down. They
can fiddle the rates as well, because it's kind of like it's one of the transparency issues. It's like, again, it's very difficult to translate. But what we were able to do as well is, because we had the figures for the gross pay in the company's house accounts. So these are accounts that are put out by the farm itself. We're able to say, okay, well, we know exactly how much everyone's getting paid, and then we're able to and we know how many employees there are, so we're able to sort of average it out like that. But it is very difficult, and and again, we're also very, very conscious that this is just one case study farm, and we're operating on incomplete information. And so really what would be ideal is that if we had the cooperation of growers to provide us with full information about how much they're actually paying workers, etc. And not only that, we're able to sort of see the pay slips that workers are able to get. And what was also helpful is that one of the worker that sort of like went through through one of these testimonies is he kept all of his pay slips, and he kept a note of his hours, and so he was able to say that and so this was a worker that ended up getting sent back to the caravan quite a lot, and they were paid about an average about £200 a week. And the case of that on the worker that gave us the testimony of like, this is how I was recruited from Nepal. He was one of the most productive workers on this farm, and he was paid about £405 a week. Again, this is all in the report. So you can see the kind of like, on average, workers get paid about £300 a week. On a low end, it's about 200. On the high end, it's about 405. So that's the kind of ranges that we're dealing with here, and then you account in the deductions on the visa scheme. Yes.
Thank you. We're tight on time now. Thanks.
Okay. All right. We'll have one more after this one.
Thanks so much. Really important topic. My name's Angela, I work in Bristol. The farm I'm involved in, we do veg boxes. So all our organic produce we source from locally. We know the workers are fairly paid, but we use 2 organic wholesalers based in London who import from Spain and other countries. And we were scratching our heads, do we know whether they're sourcing from farms that are using appalling practices? Have you got any advice?
I actually know a lot about this because so we work very closely with a union called SOCSAT, so Sindicato del Obrero de Campo, which often represents workers in the organic sector in Spain, and they're very critical of it because often, like I think, so often what these farms end up using is a lot of undocumented labour. So you have a situation where I think it's in we had a situation at a municipality in Nija, called Nija, where the local government actually bulldozed the homes, the informal sort of shantytown where a lot of these undocumented workers were living. And so we had a whole sort of pressure campaign to try and stop that. And additionally as well, there's a company that we campaigned quite heavily against called Biosabor, which is a company that on paper is whiter than white. It's got all of the kind of all of the certifications, all of the awards, etc. But in actuality, what's happening on a lot of the farms that supply them is conditions are very, very poor. So often what these organic wholesalers will have is they'll have contract farms that kind of are supplying them, and it's just that's when it starts getting a little bit murky and the relationships getting not so good. But in terms of and definitely, actually, one situation we had was a company called Ecosur, which is another, which is a river food supplier, which was accused by the union of not paying the workers the full. And this is the other issue that comes up consistently in Spain, is that there's a collective agreement that governs working conditions, which stipulates that workers must be paid overtime after 6.5 hours. They must be paid at least 51 euros a day, etc. And this is never followed. The enforcement situation is very, very poor there. So the number one thing would be to try and sort of find out which farms your wholesalers are getting through, but also as well, and this is crucial, is building a relationship with worker unions on the ground, because the different situation in Spain to the UK is that there are unions, whether it's SOCSAT or UGT or CCOO, that do represent workers and organise workers in that sector, and that's building a relationship with them, seeing their press releases when they say, hey, we have a dispute here, we need to do something about this. That's a good way. That's an essential way of solving this problem, I feel. I don't think. Do we have any more time for questions, or have we got to go? Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you.